Ladies and gentlemen, and brothers and sisters, and I suppose any trisexual element present, thank you for coming. I wouldn't come to a group of this kind without doing a little bit of homework about who you were and who you are, and I've done some checking, and I was told that there'd be quite a lot of people here who knew about Orwell, quite a lot of people who cared about Orwell, quite a lot of people who didn't know about him, quite a lot who didn't care, and some who neither knew nor cared. I'm going to speak at first to those who are in the latter category and see if I can win you over. And in my effort to do that, I hope I'll have something to say that's of interest to those who consider themselves experts on the subject, or specialists, or just interested. And I make one other promise. Is there anyone here who's been told they have to come here by their professor? Or who's having to do it for credit? Okay. Well, I'll just tell you now that I am an adjunct professor at New School University in New York, and I can sign a piece of paper if you want that says you don't have to stay. I don't do captive audiences. I certainly don't do them in the name of Orwell. So no one who has been told they have to be here has to remain. Let's just see now. The doors have been locked as I requested. Yes. Very well. But I did, in fact, want to ask you to begin by inviting you to, in a sense, close your eyes and pretend you haven't had this as a subject before or as a syllabus matter before, and actually just have a picture in your heads, the one that I have all the time. What you would have, and perhaps some of you have seen pictures of the author, is that of a slightly tall, angular, shy but not unconfident Englishman with a hollow-cheeked look, a rather dolorous look in some ways, a rather solemn look, but yet it's not the look of someone with no sense of humor. It's the look of someone who's been through quite a lot and has tried his best. But there is a final element of pessimism to it, as well as, I think, some of that hard-to-understand handsomeness for which we English people are so, I think, rightly famed. It's an ironic look, actually, is what it is. And it's the look of someone who has suffered a great deal. And I want to begin by proposing it in this manner. There were three great subjects in the century that's just closed with rather a big slam of the door behind us, that what you've heard called the 20th century. Some of you were only just born in it, I guess. And there were three, as I say, three great dramas, great crises, great moral and intellectual and ideological confrontations in that period. And you'll all have had to know about some of them. And you'll carry on hearing about this, by the way, as you will carry on hearing about this author, whether he's on a syllabus or not. You'll wonder why he keeps coming up. And part of my reply to that implied question is this. Of these three questions, which were the right of European countries, of white people in Western Europe to be exact, the right of such people to govern the rest of the world, to govern Africa and Asia and large parts of South America and Australasia, as if it was a right, as if it was a birthright. The grand confrontation between democracy and, first, National Socialism, sometimes called Nazism or fascism, totalitarian, racist, one-party, military state concept, organized for war, organized for aggression. And third, and the one that ended most recently, the confrontation between the democratic way of life and the communist alternative, where the citizen is declared to be the property of the state, and the state promises in return for this trade to make the citizen better off, better educated, better fed, with better health care, but eventually doesn't keep that promise either, but retains its hold on the citizen as property. I'm paraphrasing, but that's roughly it. These were the things that preoccupied anyone who could read or feel or think in the last century. And George Orwell got all of them right, in my judgment. This is, of course, a moral judgment of my own, but I'm willing to back it up. George Orwell's father was involved in the opium trade from then British-controlled India to China. In other words, British gunboats and warships could force Chinese cities to buy and Chinese waterways to be open to the compulsory trade in opium made in India and other British possessions. In those days, the empire believed in the war for drugs, not the war on drugs. So not that small a difference in some ways. In those days, they thought that if you gave people drugs, it would keep them quiet, as well as make money for the drug dealers. In other words, Orwell's family was built on a guilty secret, a dirty secret, a colonial secret. And he himself volunteered in his early life to become a policeman in a part of that empire, Burma, now known as Myanmar, and living under a Stone Age dictatorship. And by the experience, I think, of disliking his father and his father's business and feeling guilty about the source of the family income and feeling sick about the job he was doing, he came to a very important conclusion, which is a very modern one, by the way. In some ways, post-colonial studies are founded by George Orwell and his writing. And so are many of the works now written about the relationship between power and race and gender or sex. I'll put it as bluntly as this. If you were, in colonial Burma, the most westernized Burmese man, and you'd been to 3 European universities, and you spoke English better than most English people do, and you had 5 qualifications, it wouldn't make any difference to you. You would never be allowed to enter the Englishman's Club in Rangoon, in the capital of the country. You'd never be allowed in by the front door. You might possibly be allowed in on special occasions as a guest, but you'd never get in there. In your own country, you would be considered alien because you were born there. That would be a good definition of racism, I think. However, if you were the least educated and least empowered and least literate Burmese woman, you could go into any Englishman's villa any time you liked, as long as it was by the back door, and as long as it was a money relationship. And in fact, in Orwell's first novel, Burmese Days, he writes about a policeman who is clearly based on himself, who has a live-in mistress and servant, who he has quite clearly bought from her family. He's not even renting her, he's bought her. She's in effect a slave. And it's my strong opinion, having studied this man's life and writing, that he threw up the job. We don't know why, he never said. He just resigned as a policeman, and resigned from the colonial service and came home. But I think that he was very afraid that he would become part of the dirty secret himself, that he would either become a racist or a sadist or both by being in this situation, and wanted to repudiate this in himself. And by the way, I think that's an important point on its own, because many of you know what, as it were, the right opinion is to have on something, or what the liberal or decent view is to take on a topic, and would shudder from anyone who was a bigot. And so you should. And a lot of work went into creating a society where that choice was a fairly easy one to make. But that wasn't the case with George Orwell at a time when assumptions of this kind were very common. And the critical thing about it is he didn't face this prejudice in other people. He wasn't a liberal humanitarian facing down policemen in Selma, Alabama, who had hoses and dogs on their side. He was facing that policeman in himself. He was wondering what it would be like to be that person, and decided he'd have to vanquish it within his own personality. And that, I submit, is often the harder of the struggles to undertake. And it's worth remembering how tough that used to be. At any rate, what he understood when he'd done with this, and he was then still quite young, he had never been to university, he'd never had any money, he never had a safe or steady job, was he knew that there was a filthy secret at the heart of power, and that secret was in a sense a pornographic secret. That some people don't even need the excuse to wield power. They won't even say, we're doing it for your own good, or to civilize your colony, or to save you from communism, or to save you from fascism, or to liberate you from capitalism, or anything of this kind. No, not even an excuse. We're in power because we like it. We're in power because we enjoy punishing people. We're in power because we enjoy owning people. We enjoy telling them what they can do. We enjoy telling them when we feel like having sex with them and when we don't. We do this for its own sake. The pornography element of power is a very important thing to understand. It's very common today among a number of dictators and despots. It's an exercise of sheer cruelty. And I think it was a tremendous advantage to Orwell as a writer to have understood this right from the start. to strip away the hypocrisy that underlies authority. And he'd done all this and come back to England and decided to go out to be a tramp and then to take the dirtiest jobs he could find and pretend to be someone who was going to be arrested for drunkenness and thrown in the cells for a few nights, or sleeping in the doss houses, or hanging around among the unemployed. He went native, as we used to say, as if he was in a colony, but in his own country. He'd done all this by the time that what we call the 30s, the great political decade of the century, had got underway. So that when the grand confrontation about democracy, communism, Stalinism, fascism, Nazism hit, not just Europe but the world, he was ready for it in a way. He knew what the subtexts were. And I believe that that helped him to be prescient. It's an interesting thing about Orwell. He went to fight against fascism in Spain, against the assault of Hitler and Mussolini on the democratically chosen Republican government of Spain in 1936. He went to fight more early than most people did. He felt it evident to himself that he had to put his own body in the way. He had to become a soldier again and a policeman again, in a sense, a fighter, a disciplinarian again, and try and organize a resistance. He saw this coming more quickly than many did. But you can read him exhaustively, as I have done. I can now claim to have read every word he's written. He hardly writes anything about fascism at all. He hardly writes a single essay saying why you should be against it. He takes it for granted that when you look down the gun barrel of Hitler and Mussolini and Franco and fascism and Nazism, that you don't need to be told what's wrong with it, that here's everything you hate. Here's every bullying father, every crushed, repressed mother, every sadistic prison warder, every exploiting capitalist, every racist and Jew baiter, every thug and bully and sadist and exploiter there's ever been, all rolled into one and then refined and double distilled and redone again, so you've got the absolutely pure essence of everything that's hateful. We tend to sneer, or I've heard people sneer, at the use of the word evil by politicians. By politicians, one should probably suspect the use of this word. But it's not possible if you want to write morally, or you want to write critically, or you want to write historically. It's not possible to do without this word. Certain words are necessary. We can't do without it. Indeed, even the most delicate liberal these days will talk about the lesser evil, which, shall I say, is at least a concession to the use of the word. We can't take it out of our vocabulary. Well, he was looking it straight in the eye. And he took a bullet through the throat in Spain from the fascist side, and he nearly got a bullet in the back from the communist side. But before I get to that bit, I just must tell you, in case I'm sounding too solemn, that the bullet that went through his throat from the fascist sniper hit him right there, and it missed his larynx, it missed his carotid artery, it missed his spinal cord, and it just grazed his vocal cords, so that from then on he always spoke with a slight rasp in his voice. And he had to go to hospital, because a bullet that comes into your neck one side and goes out the other, it means you have to lie down for a bit. And everyone who came to see him knew that the bullet had gone right through it. It had missed his larynx, it had missed his carotid artery, it had missed his spinal cord, and it only grazed his vocal cords. And all of them said the same thing. Can you guess what it was? That was lucky. And he said, if I was lucky, I wouldn't have got shot in the throat at all. At the time when this tremendous menace of fascism, this sadistic, pornographic evil was assaulting civilization, there were a very large number of intellectuals and of aesthetes. That's not always the same thing. Artists and writers and intellectuals and painters, they're not all to be grouped together as they sometimes are. Some painters have no idea what the hell is going on. Some have a better idea than many intellectuals do. Some intellectuals could probably make good painters, though they don't make very good thinkers. But there was a widespread view among the anti-fascist artistic crowd, if you like, that this was not a question that had no answer, because there was already, on the other side of the Ural Mountains, an ideal socialist society. that would outlive Orwell's imperialism, the imperialism he didn't like. It would defeat that. That it would outlive the capitalism that he didn't like when he went among the poor and the downtrodden of England and France. And that it would defeat fascism by definition, that under the leadership of Comrade Stalin, a new world had been created in the East, that all questions would be answered, that no contradictions would exist anymore, that exploitation of man by man would cease, and that this was not just a potential thing, but an actual thing, that this utopia was already present, and that it was the job of all decent progressive people to fight for it. I think probably this might well open an argument between me and some of you. I think probably that Orwell's greatest achievement was to have been brave enough to say that it would be nice to think this, especially faced as we are with this deadly foe, but that what the communists think is not just a deadly illusion, in other words, a romantic but wrong idea, but it's a poisonous delusion. It is a parody of reality, it's a negation of reality, and it will end up being evil itself. And that took a lot of guts in those days. You must always think about thinkers and writers in the context in which they had to operate. Most of the people with whom Orwell had to circulate, coexist, at least half believed some of that about Soviet Russia. And it's for this reason that he always had a hard time getting his articles published, his speeches heard, or even his books in print. And so I think I would nominate of his great achievements the novels, one of which I know some of you have read, one of which I suspect some of you have been told to read. Never mind, it's better than not reading it at all. And the one that I know I assure you, you'll keep on hearing about as long as you can continue to breathe and argue, which is 1984, and its partner novel, Animal Farm. In these two novels, both of which Orwell thought of as total failures, which he wrote when he was very ill, 1984 he wrote when he was dying of tuberculosis, he exposed once and for all time the idea of the Stalinist utopia, of the idea that the citizen, if he will give up his freedom, or her freedom, for security, if you'll give to the state his right to decide, or her right to decide, if you'll give them all that and grant them power, then they will take care of his other needs. And he said, this bargain is fatal. You will end up with neither freedom nor security. You will end up with neither freedom nor food, neither freedom nor bread. You'll end up being starved and bullied and told you're being well fed. And you will not dare to point out the discrepancy between reality and the promise, because the party says the promise is the reality, and don't you dare go saying that you've confused the two. It's more than your life is worth. And he wrote this in such a way that I know I don't have to tell those of you who've read it, as to make it almost terrifying. Indeed, I still meet people younger than myself to whom 1984 is a date in their own past, who find the book frightening because it is designed to foreclose hope entirely. At the end of the book, there is nothing left to live for. The citizen is so much the property of the state that they're disposable, they're smashed, their personality is emptied, their emotions and their fears, even their sex lives, are considered open, available and contemptible by a party that runs everything. His hope, I think, was to make this so frightening that it would mobilize people to resist it. But it certainly had the effect on some, I fear, of making them feel there's nothing worth fighting for, or that resistance is futile. I don't know quite how to answer that question. I think I should leave it open to you. Ladies and gentlemen, I probably should ask, since I didn't bring a timepiece, how near I am to trespassing on my time. Very well. Well, I didn't want to speak for very much more than half an hour or 45 minutes, because I imagine that many of you came here to speak as well as to listen, and I promise you I can keep talking, but I think there may come a point where I should invite your questions. Now, how did Orwell do this? What I've sketched may seem like a lot to say about one individual, and of course the last thing he would have wanted would have been to become a plaster saint figure or an object of hagiography. In fact, I'm absolutely certain that had he survived, the thing that would have most surprised him posthumously would have been his success and his fame. As I began by saying, he died young. Actually, he died, well, let me put it like this. He only made it just into the second half of the 20th century. He died in early 1950 at the age of 46. He only just made it in the second half of the last century. That must seem to a lot of you, as it does to me. I was born in 1949, quite a long time ago. In fact, we are about as near to him as he was to Charles Dickens, about whom, by the way, he wrote very well. That's the leap of reverse memory you have to make. But he's still very modern to us. He writes about things we know. He writes about machinery, about modern tyranny, about modern warfare, about modern fear and threat, about psychiatry, about... How did he manage to do this, having died as he did, of a disease that is practically Dickensian? He died of poverty, in fact. He died of tuberculosis, which is a disease we now think of as third world. He died of the poverty of his country and his own life, and he died of the lack of available medicine. There was a treatment in the United States available for it, but he didn't know how to get it and probably couldn't have afforded it. He died a Dickensian death. He died the death that some of you who have the romantic dream of being writers, which I hope you never give up, may have imagined for yourself, in the garret with no money, but with the beautiful work just in the bottom drawer for someone to find. Don't give up that dream, by the way, if you have it. And if any of you have ever thought of taking up the craft of writing as a dissident, as an oppositionist, the life I've just been trying to describe is an exemplary one and will repay your study. So how did he manage this? How did he manage this extraordinary achievement of being right when everyone else was wrong, to put it bluntly? I think in two ways. One, by life experience. He did know that power was not its own justification, that authority didn't come from God, didn't come from tradition. It came from people who wanted power. And he understood that, and he felt that he should never stop criticizing them and exposing them. That's the first thing. Second, he realized that often this trick is masked in language. If you only read one essay of his, you must read the one that's called Politics in the English Language, in which he exposes the fraud, the way in which euphemism is used to mask brutal reality. If I was to give you an example now, I suppose I would say, to take the most recent, most obvious one, I don't think now that any member of any American administration would use the word collateral damage again to describe what it does describe, civilian casualties. Those of you who know that expression or who've known how to see through it have done, in your way, an Orwellian job, and you probably, without knowing it, owe it to Orwell that this is a capacity that you have. But that's the trick, in effect. You find a nice name for a nasty thing, and you get it spread around by making it seem technical or technological. If I could summarize it in one sentence, that would be it. He was onto that. He knew every time that the Stalin regime said, well, you know, in extraordinary times, extraordinary measures must be taken. He thought, that means mass graves. He knew without being told, by reading their own propaganda, that whatever the truth was, the propaganda was lying, and it was using nice words for disgraceful things. This is a trick that should never desert you. You can all do it for yourself. There's no reason not to do it. Interrogate what you read and what you're given in that spirit, and you'll find it all the time. It's remarkable to me, in fact, that he was able to do this and to be considered exceptional for it. But he did stick to it, and he did therefore understand how great noble ideas can turn into their opposite, and thus that in 1984 freedom is slavery. And war is peace, and people live with the negation because they believe the party or the authority or the dictator who claimed it in the first place, and they didn't have the nerve to doubt it, because if they were wrong, if they had themselves been fooled, then what would it make them? I've talked up till now about power, and I think I'll stop at this point and invite your questions by just saying this. Power is only what you allow it to be. Very many people put up with political lying and political illusions and political propaganda because if they were to denounce it, they would have to admit that for many decades they had themselves been fooled, that they had been taken for granted, that they had allowed themselves, so to speak, to be deceived. The con man's work is always done for him by the victim. The victim doesn't want to go to the police and say, I've been conned. I was so stupid that I did this. They don't wish to admit it. So in a subtle and deadly way, the dictator can dirty enough people up to make them all complicit in his rule, or I suppose her rule. Can make them the tortured yet willing, masochistic, complicit element in his own sadistic mania. Now, what you can't necessarily do about power or about authority, you can do for yourselves and your fellow readers and fellow students and fellow citizens. You can resolve not to be a citizen like that. You can resolve not to do the work of power for it. You can resolve not to let lies be told in your hearing. You can resolve not to use sloppy language that is euphemism. And then I think, I'll leave it, I think, like this. You'll realize that the reading of Orwell is not an exercise in projecting blame on others, but is an exercise in accepting a responsibility for yourself and or for yourselves. And it's for that reason that he'll always be honored and also that he'll always be hated. And I think he wouldn't have had it any other way. And as a chronicler of his, neither would I.